At 90, Clint Eastwood finally breaks the silence about a Hollywood bargain so old the paper it was typed on has turned the color of tea, a late-night recording, a gravelly voice, and one sentence that makes studio veterans go quiet. I paid for that silence, Bussy, and so did they. What did he bury back in the glory years? A set accident that never made the dailies, a magazine cover that was bought not earned, or a whispered trade with a powerful fixer who kept scandals out of print. If you fed him headlines he could sell. And wow, speak now. When reputations are museum pieces and most of the witnesses are gone, the clue isn't in an autobiography or a courtroom transcript. It's in a 3-minute tape that surfaced from a box marked 1973, Do Not Destroy, and in a memo without a signature that refers to a desert shoot, a missing reel, and a columnist who would kill the story if he got something better. If that sounds like a plot, you're not wrong. Old Hollywood ran on scripts even when there were no cameras. But to understand the confession, you have to wind the reel back to a tall kid who learned to keep his face still while the world around him blinked, to a town where favors were currency and silence was the most expensive thing you could buy. Because this scandal didn't start on a red carpet, it started in the dust, with a stunt that went wrong and a decision that would follow him for 50 years. Clint Eastwood was born on May 31st, 1930 in San Francisco, California, during the grip of the Great Depression. His father, Clinton Sr., moved the family often, chasing work along the West Coast, while his mother, Ruth, tried to give Clint and his younger sister, Jean, some sense of stability. It was a childhood marked by motion-changing towns, changing schools, and learning early how to adapt without complaint. Tall, lean, and reserved even as a boy, Clint was nicknamed Samson by the nurses when he was born. He weighed a hefty 11 pounds and already had a shock of dark hair. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but when he did speak, people listened. Friends remembered him as the kind of kid who'd quietly win the game while everyone else argued about the rules. In high school, Clint wasn't dreaming of movie stardom. He was working odd jobs: lifeguard, grocery clerk, forest firefighter, and spending weekends fixing up cars. The sea air of Oakland and the rugged trails of the Sierra Nevada shaped his patience and self-reliance. Yet there was also an eye for drama. Teachers noted the way he could hold a pause in conversation just long enough to make everyone lean in. After graduating from Oakland Technical High School in 1948, he was drafted into the U.S. Army during the Korean War. Stationed as a swimming instructor at Fort Ord, Clint wasn't in combat, but fate placed him in front of people who noticed his posture, his steady gaze, and that unshakable calm. One of those people was an assistant to a film director who suggested he try acting. Clint shrugged it off. At first, it sounded as far-fetched as walking on the moon. But by the time the 1950s rolled in, the boy who had drifted from town to town was standing on the studio lots, watching the way cameras moved and deals were made. He was a newcomer to Hollywood, but he'd already learned the rules of survival: say little, watch everything, and remember who owed you a favor. The first real break came almost by accident. In 1958, after a string of forgettable bit parts, Clint Eastwood landed the role of Rowdy Yates on the CBS Western Rawhide. At first, it was just another job, a steady paycheck, a horse to ride, and a chance to keep learning. But the show caught fire with audiences, running for 8 seasons and turning Clint's tall frame, squinting gaze, and deliberate delivery into a kind of quiet signature. Television made him a household name, but Clint wasn't content to be the cowboy from TV. When Rawhide wrapped in 1965, he took a gamble that baffled his peers: a low-budget Italian Western, directed by a relatively unknown Sergio Leone. The result? A fistful of dollars. Didn't just revive the Western, it reinvented it. By the time for a few dollars more, and the good, the bad, and the ugly hit theaters, Clint was no longer a TV star. He was an international icon. Hollywood took notice. Studios that once passed on him now wanted his name above the title. Yet Clint kept his cards close. While others courted the press, he stayed quiet, projecting a mystique that made people lean in. That silence worked. Audiences filled in the blanks with their own myths, and producers found him bankable without the baggage of overexposure. By the early 1970s, Clint had stepped behind the camera, directing Play Misty for Me. Critics were surprised. Here was the laconic cowboy, crafting suspense with the precision of a veteran filmmaker. It was the start of a second career that would earn him Oscars and cement his control over the stories he told. But in those same years, away from the studio lights, Clint was navigating a different kind of script, one not meant for public view. It involved a desert shoot, a catastrophic stunt gone wrong, and a whispered bargain with a powerful Hollywood fixer who made ugly stories disappear for a price. That deal, struck in the heat and dust of the American Southwest, would become the shadow he carried for decades, until the day he finally chose to speak. It was the summer of 1973, and the Mojave Desert was burning under a merciless sun. Clint Eastwood was in the middle of filming a gritty Western, a production so ambitious the crew joked it was too real for Hollywood. The centerpiece of the shoot was a dangerous stunt, a runaway stagecoach barreling down a steep incline, with Clint riding shotgun and a team of 6 horses thundering ahead. The cameras rolled, the dust rose, and then everything went wrong. A harness snapped, one of the horses reared, and the coach veered sharply off course. In the chaos, a stuntman named Jack Marlowe, and an old-school daredevil with decades of work under his belt, was thrown hard to the ground. The set went silent except for the wind. Jack wasn't moving. Within hours, the studio's legal department arrived on location. The verdict was grim. Jack had suffered severe head trauma. Whether he would survive was uncertain. The producers feared the headlines: Hollywood's rising star at the center of a deadly accident. That was when he showed up. Vincent Hale, a fixer whose name never appeared in credits, but whose phone number was in every studio head's desk drawer. Hale specialized in making problems vanish. He'd buried affairs, smothered scandals, and bought off reporters with stories juicier than the ones they were chasing. In this case, he offered Clint and the producers a way out. The accident would be reframed as an offset incident. Jack's medical bills would be covered quietly. His family compensated generously. And in return, the truth would be locked away in a vault of favors owed. Clint, still reeling from the accident, agreed. But Hale's deal came with a twist to seal the story. He needed Clint to do something in return. A cameo in a film for a studio ally. A public endorsement for a political figure. And most troubling, a sworn silence about a completely different incident involving another major star. It wasn't just about saving Clint's image. It was about feeding the machine that kept old Hollywood's shadows intact. Over the years, whispers about that desert day would surface, never in print. Always over late-night drinks with people who knew someone who was there. Clint never confirmed, never denied. But the price of that silence was a debt that lingered. And the list of people who knew the truth grew shorter with each passing decade. At 90, with Hale long gone and most of the players buried, Clint finally decided to tell his side, not because he wanted redemption, but because the story had stopped being just his. In the weeks after the desert incident, Clint Eastwood returned to set with the same steady composure the public had come to expect. To the crew, it looked as if nothing had happened. No mention of Jack Marlowe's fall, no hint of the late-night meetings with Vincent Hale. But inside the studio walls, the accident had left its mark. Contracts were quietly rewritten to limit on-set stunts. Insurance premiums skyrocketed, and Clint's name began appearing on a short list of actors who were too valuable to risk. The public never knew why his films suddenly shifted away from the most dangerous action sequences. Critics called it maturity, a natural evolution toward more complex roles. In truth, Clint had been told by his agent, by the studio, and by Hale that his career couldn't survive another mishap. From that point on, every project was filtered through a quiet calculus: was the risk worth the reward? And who might get hurt? The deal with Hale also had ripple effects far beyond the set. That political endorsement he'd agreed to, it put him in the orbit of figures who would shape not just his career, but his public persona for decades. Some called him principled. Others accused him of selling out. Clint never explained his choices, letting the silence do the talking. But privately, he knew those alliances were born from a single afternoon in the Mojave. And then there was Jack Marlowe. The stuntman survived, but he never worked again. The settlement bought him a house and covered his medical bills. But it also came with a clause: no interviews, no memoirs, no naming names. Clint visited him only once in a small California town where Jack lived out his days in quiet anonymity. They shook hands, said little, and parted like two men bound by a secret they couldn't share. As the years rolled on, the shadow of that day never fully left. It was there when Clint accepted his first Oscar. There when he directed films that dissected the myth of heroism. And there when he turned down roles that would have brought him back into the fray. The scandal had been buried, but the weight of it shaped the choices of a lifetime. Now, at 90, with the desert wind long faded from his ears, Clint understood that telling the truth wouldn't undo the past. But maybe, just maybe, it could unburden the man who had carried it longer than anyone should. In his later years, Clint Eastwood became almost a ghost in his own legend. He still appeared at film festivals, still directed the occasional project, but there was a measured slowness to his movements, a deliberate choice of words that spoke of someone editing himself in real time. It was during a quiet sit-down interview at his Carmel home, a place he'd retreated to for decades, that he finally allowed the past to catch up with him. The cameras were rolling for what was supposed to be a retrospective on his career. But when the conversation drifted to unresolved chapters, Clint paused for a long time. His blue-gray eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation, as if deciding whether the weight of silence was heavier than the truth. That day in the desert, he began, voice low. I thought I was protecting a film, maybe even protecting the business. But really, I was protecting myself. He spoke of Jack Marlowe without naming him, of the runaway coach, of the deal with Hale. He didn't dwell on details, didn't accuse, but for the first time, he acknowledged the choice he made and the cost it carried. The confession didn't go to the tabloids. Instead, it aired quietly as part of a long-form documentary. A few lines tucked between stories of awards and box office triumphs. Most viewers barely noticed, but for those who knew how to listen, it was the answer to a question whispered for nearly 50 years. After the cameras shut off, Clint reportedly sat for a while in silence, then smiled faintly. I don't owe it to anyone anymore, he said to the director, except maybe him. Weeks later, a bouquet of desert wildflowers arrived at a small, weather-worn grave in Central California. No note, no signature, just a gesture from one man to another, long after the world had moved on. And so, the curtain falls on a chapter Clint Eastwood never meant to share, a story that lived in the shadows as his films played in bright lights. It wasn't the kind of confession that rewrites history, but the kind that reminds us history is written in choices, and some of those choices never stop echoing. For decades, the legend of Clint Eastwood was built on grit, silence, and a stare that could level a man at 20 paces. Now, in the quiet of his 9th decade, we see the man behind that legend still standing, but finally willing to let a little of the truth slip through. What do you think? Was he right to keep that secret all those years? Or should the truth have come sooner? Share your thoughts below, and if you want more untold stories from the golden age of Hollywood, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hidden Star Stories, and join us next time as we step behind the curtain once again.